Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man has wrapped up, and I can confidently say that Marvel Animation truly does have something special in its hands. Now, a more graceful fan will just sit back and ignore all the BS controversies surrounding this project since its conception, taking the high ground and letting the peak that is Season 1 speak for itself. Unfortunately, I am not a graceful fan, because oh my gosh, they couldn't do anything to please you guys initially. Like, they literally stumbled into hate after hate, to the point that it low-key almost became impressive at a certain point, just for them to still come out thriving in the end and already primed for a fire Season 2 and an even greater Season 3 on the way. Now, I could easily make this just another congratulatory video talking about how this was the better What If than What If itself, that they produced the best iteration of Scorpion and are working on the best iteration of Tombstone, or I could talk about the absolute sorcery Coleman Domingo was doing on the mic to sound like William Dafoe at times. But I think it would be beneficial to also look back at all the complaints to contextualize the length of skepticism this project had to overcome, letting it be a reminder to audiences to give these projects a chance to breathe. Not every little story deviation means an adaptation is going to be a flop, especially when some viewer criticisms are literally addressed if they just kept watching the show. And Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man simply embraces that switch in familiar themes. So the quicker you accept it's an Elseworld story, the more fun you're going to have with this project. Off the gate, this show faced its fair share of changes, with it being well known that this was originally framed as a prequel to the immensely successful Holland Spider-Man, before being changed when the project was stuck in production limbo. It ended up popping out on the other side as a standalone Spider-Man story set in its own unique universe, a liberty allowing writers to be flexible as they didn't have to stick extremely close to any set continuity, and a decision that would ultimately be one of the best they had ever made, as a prequel series would have never reached the highs that the show has thus far. But before this season dropped, the fact that this was now considered non-canon basically left people confused as to why the show was even being made in the first place. MCU Holland was the hottest thing around, and they had just finished up his entire trilogy that was viewed collectively as his origin story. So why would we care about any other Spider-Man right now? Said by the public, things only seem to get immensely worse as we start to learn more about this project, with Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man managing to piss off both sides of the political spectrum. On one side, you have people accusing the show of forced diversity stemming from race and gender swap characters, leaving some people to feel as if these changes were unnecessary or politically motivated, which I gotta be honest, I never really understood, because wouldn't that sort of be limiting if everything looked the same in a story taking place in an alternate universe? But then, on the other end of the spectrum, the show manages to piss off an entirely different group of people, with Spider-Man voice actor commenting about being scared that the show would be too annoying and quote-unquote woke. Even trying to give the extreme benefit of the doubt and saying that maybe this was a way to recuperate some of that lost viewership from the design choices. It is still rather incredibly silly to say this, as if Spider-Man isn't a character that's intrinsically tied to progressive ideologies, with the most thing being based in one of the most diverse places on Earth. That's like saying you were happy a story about Superman isn't too much of an allegory about immigration, or a story about Batman doesn't touch too much on corporate corruption and mental illness. In the end, this meant that both sides of the proverbial fence held some sort of grudge against the show before it even premiered, so no matter how good the storytelling or characterization may have been, it had already been labeled as quote-unquote controversial. And that kind of baggage makes it really hard for people to go into a show with an open mind. Now, fortunately, if we're keeping it real though, only extremists and people who were never going to watch this show were going to boycott this show due to these ultimately trivial matters. But once the first couple of episodes rolled out, the show was immediately back in hot water again, because this show's Peter Parker felt fundamentally different. Now, every Spider-Man adaptation tweaks the character's personality and story in some way, but Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man makes some of the biggest changes to this origin and personality that we've seen in years. Comic fans have already been complaining for years that there has never been a true and faithful early Peter Parker, with this project being the most recent in a long line that implements that ramification of his earlier life, i.e., instead of presenting him as a cocky yet bold outcast who maneuvers as if he's got a chip on his shoulder like the early comics, they completely throw themselves into the good-natured yet shy and awkward nerd. But those aren't the only changes. Instead of being best friends with characters like Harry Osborn or Mary Jane Watson, this Peter is close with Nico Minoru and Lonnie Lincoln. Instead of Uncle Ben passing after Peter gets his spider, he gets his powers before. And instead of Peter getting the bite from the spider in the lab, the spider comes from a portal. Now, giving the benefit of the doubt, it is admittedly a very odd feeling to experience this story and character that is so familiar yet so unfamiliar at the same time. But that's why it's so vital to keep such an open mind, because if you keep watching, you can see these changes aren't just for change's sake, but an opportunity for these creators to take the basis of what we know and love and rearrange it in a different way for us to appreciate the story from a new light. Like going back to the spider portal fiasco, people were quick to say that they were changing the spider to be a part of another dimension because they were banking on the multiverse trend, or because they believe the writers find Peter's origin to be too boring. Not even giving the show time to explain that, spoilers, it was actually a time portal, and that spider that bit him was composed of the DNA of his future self who already had the spider powers. This plays beautifully into this grander idea in that Spider-Man isn't who he is simply because of his powers, but because of his character as Peter Parker. He is the reason for his own power, as if it wasn't for his constant, selfless acts of bravery when he gets those powers, he wouldn't have them in the first place. It's the most literal definition of fate being in one's own hands. And people were casting so much incorrect judgment on it just because they weren't patient. I even think this softer MCU version of Peter that people initially complained about works better within the context of the story in the long run due to that primary dynamic between Peter and Norman. By portraying him more reserved and gentle, that only accentuates the corruption that a demented mentor like Norman provides. Because in this story, they are essentially trying to say, what if Norman Osborn was sort of that Uncle Ben in Peter's life, and Peter has to learn to distance himself from that tunnel vision based, greed-induced mindset, as Osborn even drops the greatest line reversal with great power comes great respect. Now, you won't get any of these story complaints if you've never actually watched the show, and that's been a lot of people because they absolutely hate the animation style. The show is quite ambitious in that aspect, attempting to blend that classic comic art feel with 3D animation, giving a product that is iffy in many people's eyes. I personally didn't mind it at all, but this is easily the most subjective complaint out of a bunch of complaints that are all subjective in themselves. I'll just say this. If the animation has turned you off from starting or finishing the show, many have said they got used to it pretty quickly. So unless it physically hurts for you to watch this show, I would suggest you guys pick it back up. Especially for all you Invincible fans out there, y'all should be good when it comes to questionable animation. You know, if I'm being 100% honest with you guys right now, like really honest with you guys, I think that the biggest reason people may have initially been so apprehensive about this show has nothing to do with the show at all. Like, seriously, I think it has more to do with people just being sick of that stagnancy of a character, of Peter Parker, the literal poster boy for ageless, consistent comic character that always seems to return to their status quo in some shape or form. It's no secret whatsoever that this has been problem number one with comic fans, or just Peter Parker fans in general, because he never seems to stay at that point of growth. Never staying married, never having consistent kids, never showing the life of Spider-Man with balancing true adulthood. Always stuck as that broken, unlucky loser that will practically lose everything good at the end of every arc. Unless you're Ultimate Spider-Man, who is allowed to grow, and guess what? Is consistently the most bought book for the past year. Shocker. Mainline Peter Parker fans don't even have to look at another universe to feel that pain, as you can just look at any Miles book now and how Cody Ziegler has been on a generational run with this character, growing his rogues galleries, growing his abilities, growing his relationships, growing his character, leading it to be Miles' best run so far. By far. Going back to your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, I think with this being yet another Spider-Man adaptation set in high school, despite that only being a brief moment in the grand scope of the comics themselves, it is reminiscent of those stagnant feelings. Like, here we go again, more of the same lessons that young Peter has to learn, more of what the fans really don't want to see, automatically putting a bad taste into the viewer's mouth before the first episode even aired. And with the MCU not being on the hottest streak right now, especially Marvel animation, you get these amalgamations of emotions that just isn't fair to have when trying to properly judge a new show. I believe that your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man takes the heart of a Spider-Man story and effectively flips it on its head, truly embracing the value that these multiversal stories can have. They were very purposeful in a lot of their actions and changes, culminating in this greater appreciation of the Spider-Man mythos if you take the chance and let them tell the story they are trying to make. So many cool plot points are set up, so we are bound to have higher highs in these upcoming seasons. So to all those people already raising those pitchforks at Spider-Gwen's design already coming out because you are tired of multiple Spider-Men, just let them breathe. Did we not learn our lesson already?